Welcome to the CCG Museum, where we research and preserve the history of collectible card games to ensure their memory is preserved for future gamers. Today, we're going to take a look at Super Deck, its history and gameplay, as well as poking some good-natured fun at any oddities that come up. Now, this is my very first video, so I do hope you'll forgive me if it's a bit rough. Now, with that said, let's start today's tour. The early 1990s was a magical time for games. Pun intended. A mathematician with a penchant for designing games released a little D&D inspired card game that took the nerd world by storm practically overnight. It's only natural that such success would breed imitators. This is the story of one such imitator, Super Deck. These days, Super Deck is mostly unremembered, but those who do remember it generally recall it as one of the worst CCGs ever made, which is kind of amazing considering how early it came out. But does it deserve such infamy? To find out, we begin our story with one Marc W. Miller. Miller belongs to the old school of classic game designers. He's a celebrated designer who has won major industry awards and is even in the Origin Game Fair's Charles S. Roberts Hall of Fame for wargame designers. Other inductees include Gary Gygax and the American Steve Jackson. Marc is kind of a big deal. At least he is to old-school gamers and grognards. And if you don't know what the word grognard means, then you're probably very young, so right now would be a good time to get off of my lawn, you hooligan. Miller is probably most well known for creating the Traveler role-playing game, and for being one of the founding members of GDW, the Game Designers Workshop. No, wrong company. That's better. GDW shut down in 1996, but for over 20 years they were a rather significant player in tabletop gaming. If you've heard of games like Traveler, Twilight 2000, or Triplanetary, that was GDW. Don't worry, they did also have games that started with letters other than T. Miller had set off on his own in 1991, but kept designing games. He developed a computer game for Microprose called Challenge of the Five Realms in 1992. It was later updated for modern systems by Night Dive Studios and re-released in 2015. Unfortunately, I can't speak too much about Five Realms. I have played it a little bit, but only a short amount of time, and it seems somewhat similar to many other computer RPGs from the early 90s. Marc's next major work would be released late 1994, published by his short-lived company, Card Sharks Incorporated. Or maybe Card Sharks Inc. I can never tell how you're supposed to pronounce that. This game would of course be Super Deck. This fairly early release, just barely after Jihad and right before Galactic Empires, meant that Super Deck would be the fourth collectible card game ever released, and the first CCG not released by Wizards of the Coast or a company that would later be bought by Wizards of the Coast. It would also distinguish itself by being the first CCG to not base itself off of an existing role-playing game. Yes, technically Magic isn't directly based off of an RPG either, but its fantasy setting and artwork was clearly meant to attract players of Dungeons & Dragons and other fantasy RPGs. Maybe that's an overly broad interpretation, but that's how I'm calling it. Super Deck instead was based off of comic book superheroes. This was not because Marc is related to comics author Frank Miller. Nor is he actually Mark Allen Miller, nor is he Scottish comics author Mark Millar? Miller? That's gotta be Miller, right? Scottish comics author Mark Miller spelled with an A. Nor is he the Mark Miller that owns a chain of Subaru dealerships in Utah. That last one doesn't have anything to do with comics. I kinda lost the plot here a bit. The point being, Mark Miller is a surprisingly common name. Marc, spelled with a C, Miller, was hoping to attract a general audience of more casual gamers by using a theme that was far less niche than high fantasy. And before you say that comics are niche too, remember this was the mid-90s. Comics were regularly selling hundreds of thousands or even millions of copies. Comics were fairly mainstream back then, and almost nobody except the most hardcore of nerds watched their movies. Pretty much the reverse from today. The base set of Super Deck was released in September of 1994, just barely after Wizards of the Coast released their second CCG, Jihad, which would later be renamed Vampire: The Eternal Struggle, which was based on White Wolf's extremely popular RPG, Vampire: The Masquerade. The base set consists of 160 cards, which come in boxes of 10 60-card starter packs, costing $7.95 each. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $16.37 in 2023 dollars. There were no booster packs. Predominantly orange with a yellow stripe, it may not be overly ornate, but the colors themselves do bring to mind a classic superhero costume with simple patterns and bold colors. Scalpel, one of the game's villains, graces the sides of the box. The individual starter boxes continue the aesthetic, the yellow stripe turning into a lightning bolt, with Scalpel front and center. Inside, you find your 60 cards sealed with the rules book, though book might be a slight misnomer. It's a single sheet, double-sided, folded into 8 pages, 7 pages of rules and 1 of credits. After the base set release, we had Slim Packs, released in June of 1995. This is Super Deck's one and only expansion. It didn't have any symbols to mark it as an expansion, just the copyright date of 1995 as opposed to the base set's 1994. It technically introduced 160 new cards to the game, though some of those cards were doubles of cards with the artwork colored differently. Sometimes the differences in coloring are so slight it's kind of hard to tell the difference between the two. In fact, Slim Packs reused a lot of artwork. Some of it for doubles of a card, some of it is the same art reused or recolored for different cards. The reuse of artwork appears to have been at least partially because not all of the artwork had been turned in on time and the printing deadline was coming up, so improvisation was required. The doubles of cards were the result of Miller needing to fill printing slots but running out of ideas for more cards as the printing deadline came up. Though one of my favorite cards is probably also due to Miller's lack of ideas. The handy math table is, I think, a pretty genius addition. You'll see why when we get to the gameplay. Slim Packs came in boxes of 20 30-card packs. This box abandoned orange in favor of a solid yellow. And instead of the villainous Scalpel, we have the hero Foresight. The packs themselves were also yellow with Foresight gracing the front. The Slim Packs expansion was called that because, well, the decks were slim. Having only 30 cards each naturally made them half the size of a 60-card deck. This was meant to give the players a booster pack-like experience that the main set lacked. In Slim Packs' case, it was just $3.50 in 1995 dollars, just over $10 in 2023 money. It didn't seem to catch on, though, as sales didn't improve for Super Deck, and no other game copied that idea. While the size of the booster packs was still pretty variable at this early stage in CCG development, 30 cards seemed to have been too much, especially for a game that wasn't particularly popular. It also seems that a lot fewer of the Slim Packs had been printed as well. These days it's not easy to find unopened decks of the base Super Deck set, but it's out there, it's far from impossible to find them. Meanwhile, coming across an unopened Slim Pack in the wild seems akin to winning the lottery. Heck, coming across cards from the Slim Packs at all is rather unlikely. Finally, if you're really, really lucky, like win the lottery with a ticket you found on the ground lucky, you can find a 55-card deck of promotional cards. To the best of my knowledge, they had no special packaging aside from being wrapped in plastic. The main purpose of these packs was 8 of the promotional cards inside of them. You see, the Slim Packs expansion had 2 chase cards you could find and mail into Card Sharks in exchange for several powerful promo cards found in these decks. Remember, in the 1990s, physically mailing stuff to people with a self-addressed stamped envelope was a fairly normal thing to do. Anyways, the odd thing about these decks is that there are other promotional cards included that you supposedly wouldn't be able to get through that mail-in offer. I assume these would be given to retailers or handed out at conventions, though some of these promos, again, were actually copies from cards found in Slim Packs. Strangely, one of these was instead an alternate version of a card from the Slim Pack. That is, the same name, same artwork but different colors, and also different stats. But the rest of them are exact copies of the cards in the Slim Packs. Just that one card is different. Odd, but whatever. Something worth noting is that, as far as I can tell, the promo packs do have all the same cards in them, but not in the same amounts. So you might get 1 of card X in one pack, but 3 in the next. Also noteworthy, especially for collectors, is that the promo pack card's coloration is slightly off. I'm talking just barely, but if you look closely and you aren't color vision deficient, you can tell. In addition, the promo packs have noticeably more rounded corners than those found in the main sets. This is a pretty significant difference too. This can be very useful to a collector to identify if a card is from the slim packs or if it's a promo card. Also, on a more cynical note, someone experienced in marking cards could probably use that as an easy way to identify where certain cards are. Remember, you may trust your opponent, but always cut their deck. And so, with only 2 releases under its utility belt, Super Deck quietly faded into the background as the CCG glut hit full swing. It's a short tale, but possibly an instructive one. Because it's remembered as a terrible game, people often think of Super Deck as a huge failure. However, the success, or lack thereof, of Super Deck is a matter of degrees. Since it came out so early and was able to mostly avoid the upcoming CCG glut of 1995, Super Deck actually sold fairly well, all things considered. It was hardly a bestseller, but nobody lost their shirt over it either. Apparently, the investors in Card Shark's little enterprise were satisfied with their returns, and Miller made a profit for himself. It just wasn't enough to justify continuing the venture after Slim Decks. So Super Deck was discontinued and officially died. Card Sharks would likewise close its doors, never to open again. Strangely, this was probably the best thing they could have done, quitting while they were ahead, as it were. Because if Miller had waited another year to release the game, it's very likely Super Deck would have been a financial failure. Getting out of the gate so early certainly seems to have worked out in Super Deck's favor. And if they had tried to release another expansion after 1995, it would have been extremely difficult for them to have found space in what had already become an overcrowded market, especially since Super Deck already had a reputation for not being very good. As for Miller, well, he never left the gaming scene. When Game Designers Workshop closed down in 1996, he bought the rights to several of the games he designed for them and has continued supporting them to this day. They're not market-dominating titles, but they continue to sell well and are very well loved, especially the Traveler RPG. Super Deck seems to be an odd black mark on Miller's otherwise spotless record. It's like finding out that the safest driver you know once got caught doing 95 in a school zone. If you want to see what Miller is up to currently, you can check out his website at farfuture.net. If you're an old fogey like me, nostalgic for the cyber 90s of yesteryear, the page design is a wonderful slice of nostalgia on this cold, modern internet. So what exactly was it about Super Deck that made it so hated in its day? Well, the answer is simplicity itself. By that, what I mean is very few people like a game with too much complexity, but Super Deck had almost none at all. At its heart, Super Deck is a draw one, play one style game, a la Uno, Crazy Eights, or any of 1,000 other games you can think of. Of course, Super Deck is slightly more complicated than most games of that type, but only slightly. You and your opponent, because this is strictly a two-player game, both control a superhero on your right and a supervillain on your left. Each hero fights the opposing villain. Your goal is to have both your hero and your villain strong enough to overpower their respective rivals at the same time, by 10 or more points. You do this by adding plus and multiplier cards to your combatants to increase their point values. You can also play cards to reduce or negate the bonuses of your opponent's cards. Some cards will affect the game in a larger way, such as removing cards on your opponent's side, or granting your hero a sidekick or your villain a partner, and those cards can each take their own pluses and multipliers to give you even more points. Keep a running tally of your character's power levels by adding the plus and minus cards in the stack to their base power, and then multiplying that by the multiplication card. Then add any other bonuses they may have, such as helpers or sidekicks. Once you are in a position to win, you declare Last Chance to let your opponent know they have one turn left to either get back in the game or lose. As you can see, the gameplay is very simple. Inquest magazine said it was so easy you could teach your dog to play, and that your dog could probably beat you. Strategy is almost non-existent, and Magic had set such a high bar for strategy in CCGs, it's hard to imagine such a simple game connecting to very many people, even people in the casual audience that Miller was trying to reach. Super Deck suffers greatly from card selection, that is, a lack thereof. It's not that the card pool is too small, although compared to most CCGs it is rather small. No, the real problem is that the strict linear mathematical nature of the game means that deck construction really boils down to throwing all the highest number cards in your collection together, plus a few other cards for their effects. And since some effects are much more powerful or useful than others, well, don't expect much in the way of metagaming. It's almost entirely a matter of who has the best numbers. There's also a bit of confusion thrown into deck building with a bunch of cards that have the same name as other cards, but have different game effects. Cards like Time Warp and Time Warp, which have different art and similar effects, forcing the last turn to be replayed, but one of them allows you to replay the same cards if you desire, while the other doesn't. Why couldn't one be called Time Twist to avoid confusion? It was probably just a simple oversight, but it really should have been caught. Now look at Spaceship and Spaceship. They have the same art, just with slight variations, but one is for the hero and the other is for a villain, and they grant completely different bonuses. Or Sinking Ship and Sinking Ship, which have nearly identical art from different artists, nearly identical stats, and nearly identical flavor text. There's even the similarly titled Alien Virus and Alien Plague, which have different art and different titles, but the same effect. How's that for confusing? Are we meant to be able to stack our deck with a bunch of these for their rather powerful effect? I don't even want to talk about the 6 different sidekicks and 4 different partners. So the gameplay is not great. But what about the cards themselves? To be honest, while keeping in mind that different people have different tastes, I feel that there's a lot to like about the aesthetic of Super Deck. Just take the card backs. The design is simple, with bold colors, very eye-catching, and the card art on the front is incredible. Well, some of it is at least. As someone who read a lot of comics in the 80s and 90s, the superhero artwork is very nostalgic for me. I get that some people might be turned off by how rough it appears. I admit it's not the cleanest artwork ever made, but it's far from bad. Again, some of it at least. And this is because many, if not most, of the artists who worked on Super Deck were genuine comic pros who either worked at the major publishers like DC and Marvel, or they had significant indie works. You've got the likes of Alfredo Alcala, Sal Velluto, Marc Heike, I hope I'm saying that right, Howard Binder, Vince Musacchia, and Jay Lynch, just to name a few, making art for this game. Heck, some of the artists, like Brian Michael Bendis, had prominent positions at the major publishers as recently as 2021. There do seem to be a few fan artists mixed in with the group, and their work is easily the weakest of the set. The card's layout, on the other hand, is good enough. Very simple design, likely inspired by Magic, but with super decky colors. Nothing to write home about. The real problem comes when the artwork leaves the confines of the art box. It has the potential to look cool, but tends to cover up the name of the card instead. The numbers, being an important part of the game, are placed on the artwork according to their function of base number, addition, subtraction, or multiplication, which is a nice visual shorthand that makes it easier to do your math. However, there's also a problem in that the artwork tends to obscure the various numbers. While Card Sharks did take pains to try and keep the numbers visible, there are still far too many cards where the numbers are difficult to see or nigh illegible. And there are some really simple ways around these problems, like adding a thin white border to the numbers so the outline is still clear when surrounded by dark colors. It's a major oversight that really should have been caught. I do enjoy a lot of the flavor text. It's simple, but manages to be cheesy and sometimes self-aware of how cheesy it is. Despite a couple of characters and organizations getting multiple mentions, Miller never really built any sort of deep lore, which is a shame. A coherent lore could have helped hold the game together in some ways. Perhaps if Super Deck had been a runaway hit, he might have fleshed out the background a bit more and made comics based on the game, but meh. The truth is, it might actually be a good thing that Super Deck never made it big. This is because... how do I put this? Well, Super Deck may have taken a little too much inspiration from mainstream comics. I mean, there are a few copyrighted characters from some indie titles that were lent for use in the game, such as the heroes Mr. Fixit and Murcielaga the She-Bat, who for some reason is a villain in the game, as well as the villain Mantis Man. But those aren't the problem. Permission was explicitly given for their use. It's the heroes that look like Chinese knockoffs you'd buy on Temu that they would have had to have worried about. For instance, take Blade here. Not only does he share a name with a Marvel Comics hero, he could easily be the cousin to a certain DC villain. Or Electro. Same name as a Spider-Man baddie, looks like the purple Ghost Rider named Vengeance. Both Floron and Mutaton are totally not Swamp Thing. Just like Giant Dino Monster is totally not Godzilla. Something tells me that Paladine here has strong leadership skills. Shock could be Mr. Sinister straight up. Talons. A purple-skinned villain with a wrinkly face and a prominent ring on his finger. That should be fine, I think. Just as long as you keep him away from the gauntlets of power. Just in case. Vector here is a black high school student with energy powers. Sure seems a lot like a white-haired Static. Excuse me, Mr. Miller? Capcom is on the line? DC Comics won't make a fuss. Bring forth the demon Terracus. I can't tell who this sidekick is ripping off more, the question from DC Comics or the blank from Dick Tracy. And these examples aren't even everything. So yeah, in a way it's probably good for Miller that Super Deck didn't do exceedingly well. If it had, DC and Marvel might have noticed it and called their lawyers. But that's not to say that all the artwork is borderline and copyright infringing. Some of it is amazing, some of it is terrible, and some of it is downright hilarious. Bear Claw. That 90s radical spelling mixed with a bear that looks like a raccoon. And for some reason I always get hungry when I talk about Bear Claw. Dang it, now that I've mentioned Bear Claw, I want to hit up a bakery for some reason. Why does Crud look like he's punching himself in the face? Also, why is he named Crud? This card means that Super Deck probably takes the prize for being the first anime CCG. Okay, why is Radioactive Hazard a peril? Isn't this how like 90% of the superheroes got their powers back in the 50s? Look, I get that it's normal for a superhero or villain to have a secret identity, but this card just shouldn't apply to everybody the way it does. How does someone like Killer Squash get a secret identity? Shrink Ray? What did Ray ever do to deserve that? Oh, never mind. I can't be the only one who thinks that he looks kind of like that Anthony Adams rubbing his hands meme, can I? At least vaguely. I love this one. I love this one so much. I laugh every time I see it. They took the concept of giant computer so literally, and that enormous floppy boot disk is even funnier today than it was back then. There is nothing funny about this guy's name. It doesn't matter that he has a terrible 80s porn stash, nor that it says he can make his body super rigid, or that he can draw the rigidity out of objects with his touch. This is a perfectly normal superhero, and don't you dare laugh at him. Especially not if you're a doctor, because you should know that if his power lasts longer than 4 hours, it could be a serious problem. Look, I'm not saying there are no thugs wearing three-piece suits out there. I'm just saying when I think thug working for a comic book supervillain, my first thought is not a banker with a couple of scars. I'm really glad this guy has W on his forehead, otherwise I might have assumed that that was something other than water. Death Hug. I mean, what do you say about that? It's the perfect name. Captain California, for when you can only afford the cheapest of Captain America knockoffs. Deus Vult, baby. Freeze Ray? What did Ray do to deserve that? Oh, never mind. This is honestly one of my favorite cards. Not just because it's one of the best cards in the game, but because Forbidden Planet is one of the best movies ever made. I can't help but fear that this card was designed as a way to deal with a reduced art budget. This one card officially made Super Deck the most metal CCG in existence. At least until Doom Trooper was released the following year. Ultimately, I feel that Super Deck was introduced as the wrong kind of game. You see, A big part of any collectible card game is the collectability. There's no way around that, it's inherent in the randomness of each pack. Now, a smart company will tie that collectability to deck construction by making a wide variety of cards with different mechanics, while ensuring that there are plenty of useful cards in all the rarity slots. This means that you can make a whole bunch of different kinds of decks. Super Deck doesn't do that. The game is so simple, there really isn't much room for card variety, and when you get down to it, all you really have to do is put all your best cards in your deck and hope your opponent's cards have smaller numbers. If it had been a simple boxed game using a shared deck of 60 to 80 cards with rules for more than two players, it could have been a decent game. Not groundbreaking or best selling, but not at all bad. But as a collectible card game, it just didn't work the way it needed to in order to find a larger audience. Or any audience, really. The fact that deck building boiled down to stack your deck with the biggest numbers you have kind of killed any potential strategies that would make the game compelling. So, is Super Deck one of the worst CCGs ever made? Yeah, it really is. I do feel bad admitting that since it's got stuff I do like about it, and in researching the game, I got to know Marc Miller a little bit, and he's a pretty stand up guy. But in the end, gameplay is king. I wouldn't say it's the absolute worst CCG ever made, but it's solidly bottom tier. So if you're a pure gamer looking for a hidden gem, Super Deck is definitely not for you. If you absolutely want to go ahead and play the game as a CCG anyways, I think it would probably be best to throw out deck building and just use each starter pack as is, kind of like Keyforge. Maybe let each player remove 10 to 20 cards to streamline their deck. But again, I would throw out normal deck building. Alternatively, if you have children, I would argue that this would be a great game for younger kids, especially ones currently learning multiplication. I could see this being a great tool to help them develop their math skills. But that's about it. If, however, you're a collector, then Super Deck is rare enough and historically important enough to go ahead and seek out. Just under 350 cards for a complete set of everything, it's not too difficult to complete a set, assuming you can actually find slim packs or promo cards. So there we have it, the history of Super Deck. I hope you found it educational, and I'll see you again for the next CCG Museum video. Have fun out there, and always remember to cut the deck. Thank you for watching this pilot video of my CCG Museum series. I'm new at this, so feel free to leave suggestions and constructive criticism in the comments. If you liked it, then please share it around. I'm not planning on making this a full-time channel or anything like that, but I am planning to make more of these videos, and the more people that watch them means that I'll put more emphasis on finishing these more quickly. Once again, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great day.